You didn't fail because you are weak. You failed because you were sold a lie that is slowly killing your potential. For years, the self-help industry has screamed at you to just do it, to grind harder, and to find more willpower. They've turned discipline into a moral autopsy, telling you that if you can't get out of bed or finish that project, it's a character flaw. It's a stain on your soul. But here is the cold, hard truth: willpower is a biological fuel, and you are running on empty. By trying to force yourself to be disciplined, you are actually creating the very resistance that stops you. You are a warrior trying to sharpen his sword by hitting it against a rock. You aren't getting sharper, you're just breaking the blade. The unseen cost of your procrastination isn't just a missed deadline or a messy room. It is the slow, agonizing erosion of your self-trust. Every time you set an alarm and hit snooze, a small part of your spirit dies. Every time you promise yourself tomorrow is the day and tomorrow becomes another blur of distractions and cheap dopamine, you are telling your subconscious that your word is worthless. This is the willpower trap. The more you rely on it, the more you realize it's a finite resource that evaporates the moment you face real stress. You are living in a state of perpetual internal war, and in a war where you are both the attacker and the defender, the only certain outcome is total exhaustion. But what if I told you there is a different way? A way used by the most lethal warriors in human history, the samurai of the Rinzai Zen school. They didn't rely on willpower. They relied on a state called Mushin. Mushin literally translates to no mind. It is a state where the gap between intention and action is zero. There is no thinking about doing. There is only doing. It is an ancient technology for a modern problem, a way to move through your tasks with the same effortless fluidity that water moves down a mountain. While the world tells you to build a bigger engine, I am going to show you how to remove the brakes. We are going to combine the ruthless efficiency of Japanese Kata training with the microtask principles of Kaizen to rebuild your nervous system from the ground up. Before we dive into the blueprint that will kill your old self, you need to decide if you are a spectator or a practitioner. This channel is not for the curious. It is for the men who have realized that their current life is a prison and philosophy is the key. If you are ready to stop negotiating with your own mediocrity, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Our next deep dive will reveal Miyamoto Musashi's hidden code for becoming unbeatable. You cannot afford to miss it. Now, look at your life. Look at the projects gathering dust and the goals that have become ghosts. The cost of staying the same is higher than the cost of change. It's time to stop the war. It's time to find the silenced. To understand why your current approach to discipline is failing, you must look into the mirror of a man named Elias. Elias is 32 years old, living in a modern apartment that looks successful on the surface but feels like a tomb on the inside. He is an architect by trade, or at least, he was supposed to be a great one. He has the degree, the expensive drafting software, and a library of books on design that he hasn't opened in 3 years. Elias is you. He is the man who wakes up every morning at 7 a.m. with a heavy, leaden feeling in his chest, knowing that the mountain of work he ignored yesterday has only grown taller in the night. His daily routine is a masterclass in slow-motion self-destruction. He sets 5 alarms, each 10 minutes apart. By the time he finally rolls out of bed at 7:50 a.m., he has already lost his first battle. He starts his day in a state of reaction. He checks his phone before his feet hit the floor, drowning his brain in the cortisol of work emails and the cheap dopamine of social media. He tells himself he's getting settled, but he's actually paralyzing his prefrontal cortex. He spends his mornings in a fog of anticipatory overthinking, staring at a blank CAD file, his mind racing through all the ways he might fail, all the ways the client might reject his vision, and all the effort it will take to simply begin. By noon, he is mentally exhausted despite having accomplished nothing. The unseen cost for Elias wasn't just a stagnant career, it was the quiet humiliation of being a man of potential. People still told him he was talented, which felt like a knife in the gut because he knew talent without agency is just a slow-acting poison. He tried everything. He bought planners that stayed empty. He watched motivational videos until his eyes burned, feeling a temporary surge of inspiration that evaporated the moment he closed the browser. He was trapped in the willpower trap, convinced that if he just hated himself a little more, or pushed a little harder, the gears of his life would finally click into place. The breaking point didn't come during a massive failure, it came during a moment of silence. It was a Tuesday evening, raining against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Elias was supposed to present a landmark skyscraper proposal the next morning. He looked at his screen. It was 9 p.m. The file was nearly empty. He had spent 10 hours working, yet there was nothing to show for it but a frantic, scattered mind. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw a man with slumped shoulders, a receding spirit, and eyes that had forgotten how to look at the future with anything but feared. In that moment, he realized that if he didn't change, this was his life. He wasn't waiting to start, he was already finished. The realization was a cold, visceral physical sensation, a hollow ache in his solar plexus. He wasn't just procrastinating on a project, he was procrastinating on his existence. He realized he was losing his life one tomorrow at a time. The humiliation of his own inconsistency became so heavy that he couldn't breathe. He didn't need a new app or a better alarm clock. He needed a rebirth. He needed to find a way to act that didn't involve the agonizing, failing engine of his own ego. He needed to stop being the architect who couldn't build and become something else entirely. Driven by the cold terror of his own stagnation, Elias sought out a man he had heard of only in whispers, an old professor turned recluse named Kenzo. Kenzo lived in a modest home on the edge of the city, where the concrete jungle began to surrender to the stillness of the pine forest. He was a practitioner of Kyudo, the art of the Japanese bow, and a scholar of Zen. When Elias arrived, he expected a lecture on hustle culture or a complex productivity system. Instead, he found an old man in a simple charcoal kimono, sweeping the stone path leading to his dojo with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic grace. Elias poured out his soul. He spoke of his willpower trap, his failed deadlines, and the crushing weight of his own potential. "I need to learn how to force myself to work," Elias pleaded, his voice cracking with the desperation of a drowning man. "I need more discipline. I need to be stronger." Kenzo stopped sweeping. He didn't look at Elias with pity, he looked at him with a piercing, quiet clarity that made Elias feel as though his very thoughts were being examined. "You speak of discipline as if it were a whip you use on a stubborn horse," Kenzo said, his voice like the sound of river stones grinding together. "But you are both the horse and the rider. If you whip the horse enough, eventually, it will simply refuse to move. You do not need more strength. Strength is rigid. Rigid things break. You need to learn the art of katen, the small turn." Kenzo invited him into the dojo. There were no computers, no clocks, and no motivational posters. Only a single bow and a target. "I will not teach you how to work," Kenzo said. "I will teach you how to keep a promise. Your problem is that your word has become hollow. You tell yourself you will work for 8 hours, and your spirit knows you are lying. Therefore, the internal war begins before you even touch your desk." The mentor then did something that felt like an insult to Elias's intelligence. He gave him a task so small it felt ridiculous. "For the next 7 days, you will not try to design a skyscraper. You will not try to fix your career. Every morning at 8 a.m., you will walk to your drafting table, pick up a single pencil, and sharpen it. That is all. Once the pencil is sharp, you are free to leave. You are forbidden from doing any more work than that." Elias was stunned. "That's it? Sharpening a pencil? That won't save my business." Kenzo leaned in, his gaze narrowing. "Standard advice tells you to dream big and push through. I am telling you to be small. You are currently incapable of managing your own attention because you have lost the ability to execute without negotiation. By making the task microscopic, we remove the ego's ability to argue. You cannot tell me you are too tired to sharpen a pencil. You cannot tell me it is too complicated. This is the Kaizen principle in its purest form. We are not building a habit of drafting, we are building a habit of beginning. We are proving to your nervous system that when you say you will do something, it happens. Without debate. Without friction. Kenzo's rejection of standard willpower was absolute. He explained that by choosing a task with zero resistance, you bypass the amygdala, the part of the brain that triggers the fight or flight response when faced with a daunting project. Elias left feeling confused and slightly humiliated, but for the first time in years, he had a task he knew, with absolute certainty, he could not fail. On the first morning, Elias sat at his desk at exactly 8 a.m. He felt foolish. The pencil sharpener sat there, a small plastic sentry on a vast, empty mahogany battlefield. He picked up a wooden H2 pencil, felt the grain of the wood, and began to turn the handle. The shavings fell away like the layers of his old, ego-driven self. It took 30 seconds. When he finished, he felt a strange, quiet pulse of satisfaction. For the first time in months, he had done exactly what he told himself he would do. There was no internal war. There was no negotiation. By the third day, the early wins began to manifest in a subtle, psychological shift. Elias noticed that the dread associated with his desk was beginning to evaporate. He was practicing the Japanese concept of ikigai, not in the sense of finding a grand life purpose, but in finding the reason to get up. By narrowing his focus to a singular, non-negotiable point, he was clearing the mental clutter that usually paralyzed him. He was discovering that momentum is not a lightning bolt that strikes from the sky, it is a fire built one splinter at a time. During his next visit, Kenzo introduced him to the deeper philosophy behind this microscopic start, hara-hachi-bu. While traditionally a dietary rule, to eat until you are only 80% full, Kenzo applied it to the expenditure of the soul. The West teaches you to drain the well every day, Kenzo explained. They tell you to work until you collapse. But a collapsed man cannot wake up with joy. If you leave 20% of your energy in the tank, you create a vacuum of desire. You leave the desk wanting to do more. This is the secret to consistency. Elias began to see the brilliance in the micro-task. Because the task was so small, he had no cognitive load. He wasn't spending his mental currency on deciding whether to work, he was spending it on the work itself. He began to apply this to his drafting. After sharpening the pencil, he gave himself a new, tiny goal: draw one single line of the skyscraper's foundation. Just one. The physical and mental momentum was undeniable. His nervous system, once wired for avoidance, was being recalibrated. He was entering a state of shoshin, or of beginner's mind. He stopped worrying about the grand architect he was supposed to be and focused on the man who was simply present with the pencil. The early wins weren't in the blueprints he was starting to produce, they were in the silence of his mind. He was no longer waking up in a state of reaction. He was waking up in a state of intention. Kenzo watched him and nodded. You are learning that the path is not a leap over a chasm, but a series of steady steps on solid ground. You are no longer fighting the mountain, you are becoming the mountain. But be warned, Elias, the ego does not die quietly. It is waiting for you to feel confident. It is waiting for the moment you think you have mastered the no mind so it can trap you once again. The momentum felt like armor. For 2 weeks, Elias was untouchable. He had moved from sharpening pencils to drafting for hours, his hands moving with a precision he hadn't felt since university. But the universe has a way of testing a man's new skin. It happened on a Thursday, a day of cascading failures. A major investor pulled out of his firm's secondary project. A legal dispute arose over a previous design. His phone didn't stop vibrating. Each notification was a tiny explosion of stress that chipped away at his newfound peace. That night, the old Elias returned with a vengeance. Exhausted and emotionally drained, he sat at his desk and looked at his skyscraper blueprints. They didn't look like progress anymore, they looked like a lie. The internal war he thought he had won reignited with a blinding fury. "Who are you kidding?" the voice hissed. "You're just a guy who sharpens pencils while your world falls apart." The shame was physical. He closed his laptop, walked to the kitchen, and spiraled. He spent the next 6 hours in a trance of distraction-seeking, junk food, mindless scrolling, and numbing entertainment. He went to bed at 3 a.m., his soul feeling like ash. The next morning, he couldn't even look at the drafting table. He had relapsed. The cycle of inconsistency had reclaimed him, and the humiliation was deeper this time because he had tasted the alternative. He returned to Kenzo, not with a question, but with a confession. "I failed," Elias said, his head bowed. "The system broke. I'm back to where I started." The discipline was a fluke. Kenzo did not look disappointed. In fact, he smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of the lips. He pointed to a ceramic bowl on the table. It had been broken once, but the cracks were filled with shimmering gold lacquer. "This is kintsugi," Kenzo said. "It is the physical manifestation of Wabi-Sabi, the philosophy of finding beauty in imperfection and the cycle of growth and decay. You think your failure has ruined the work. I tell you the failure is the work." Kenzo explained that the ideal self Elias was chasing, the perfect, unwavering machine, was a Western myth that leads only to despair. Wabi-Sabi teaches that nothing is finished, nothing is perfect, and nothing lasts. By falling, Elias had finally reached the most important part of the training, the recovery. "The difference between a master and a novice is not that the master never falls," Kenzo said, his voice firming. "It is that the master has practiced the art of getting up so many times that the fall loses its power. This is Gambaru, toughing it out through the dark times. You are mourning your perfection, but perfection is a prison. Embrace the crack in your discipline. Fill it with the gold of your new understanding. The fact that you are here, admitting the fall, means the old Elias is already dead. The old man would have hidden in shame for months. You came back in 24 hours. Elias realized that his shame was just another form of ego. He was so busy judging his failure that he was missing the opportunity to simply begin again. Wabi-Sabi allowed him to breathe. It transformed his discipline from a rigid glass rod into a flexible piece of bamboo. It could bend under the wind of life's chaos, but it wouldn't snap. He realized that a streak of successful days is a vanity metric. True discipline is the ability to restart on the day you feel like a failure. While the ancient wisdom of Kenzo and the philosophy of Wabi-Sabi provide the spiritual framework for Elias's transformation, it is essential to ground these concepts in the hard reality of modern science. What Elias experienced as no mind is not just a poetic metaphor, it is a measurable neurological transition. To understand why you procrastinate, you must understand the geography of your own brain. Specifically, the eternal struggle between the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia. The prefrontal cortex is the executive office of the brain. It handles logical reasoning, complex planning, and, critically, willpower. However, as researchers at Harvard and Stanford have demonstrated, this region is incredibly energy-intensive. It is the most modern part of our brain, and it tires easily. This is what Roy Baumeister called ego depletion. When you try to force yourself to work through sheer discipline, you are redlining your prefrontal cortex. By the time you've decided what to work on and how to start, your cognitive fuel is gone. This is why willpower is a failed tool for long-term consistency. It is a limited resource that evaporates under stress. In contrast, the basal ganglia are the engine room. This is an ancient, deep brain structure responsible for motor control and, more importantly, habit formation and procedural memory. When an action moves from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia, it becomes automatic. It no longer requires willpower because it no longer requires a decision. This is the neuroscience of Mushin. By using the microtask method, Elias was bypassing the prefrontal cortex entirely. He wasn't deciding to design a skyscraper, he was simply executing the procedural habit of sharpening a pencil. Because the task was so small, it didn't trigger the brain's effort alarm, allowing the basal ganglia to take the wheel. Furthermore, studies from MIT on neural chunking show that once a small action is solidified in the basal ganglia, the brain begins to crave the completion of the sequence. This is the momentum Elias felt. By removing the friction of starting, he was hacking his dopamine regulation. Instead of seeking dopamine from distractions, his brain began to release it in anticipation of the task itself. This is what neuroscientists call a somatic marker. Your body begins to feel the rightness of the action before you even perform it. The most profound shift, however, is the identity shift. Most people try to change their outcomes, the blueprints, or their processes, the drafting. But true, permanent change only happens at the level of identity. By keeping a micro-promise to himself every day, Elias was providing his brain with evidence of a new identity. He was no longer an architect who struggles to work, he became a man who never misses a start. According to the concept of neuroplasticity, every time you execute without negotiation, you are physically thickening the neural pathways associated with that identity. You aren't just changing what you do, you are changing who you are at a cellular level. You aren't using discipline anymore, you are disciplined. The man who stands on the podium today at the International Architecture Biennale is unrecognizable from the shell of a human who once stared at a blank screen in a rain-slicked apartment. Elias is no longer an architect of potential. He is the creator of the Zenith Spire, a structure that has redefined the city's skyline. But the transformation isn't visible in the steel and glass, it is visible in his eyes. There is a stillness there, a profound absence of the frantic, twitchy energy that defines the modern, overstimulated man. This transformation has rippled outward, touching every corner of his legacy. His family no longer sees a father who is physically present but mentally absent, lost in a fog of unfinished tasks and mounting guilt. They see a man who is all in. When he is with them, he is in Mushin, fully present, without the internal noise of what he should be doing. He has regained the respect of his peers, not through flashy bursts of brilliance, but through a terrifying, relentless consistency. He has become a monster of habit, a man whose word is as solid as the foundations he designs. He didn't just get better, he committed a deliberate act of ego suicide. He killed the old Elias, the negotiator, the procrastinator, the victim of his own moods. In his place stands a practitioner. He has realized that self-worth is not something you find in a book or a video, it is the byproduct of a nervous system that no longer fights itself. His legacy is not just the buildings he leaves behind, but the standard of masculine discipline he has set for everyone in his orbit. He has moved from the war of willpower into the peace of the path. Now, we move from the story of Elias to the reality of your own life. You have seen the cost of the willpower trap, and you have seen the silent power of Mushin. But knowledge without application is just another form of procrastination. To become the man you were meant to be, you must stop being a consumer of ideas and start being a practitioner of the path. The framework is simple, but it is not easy. It requires you to swallow your pride and accept that your ego is the primary obstacle to your greatness. The Mushin blueprint consists of 3 non-negotiable pillars. First, the death of negotiation. You must identify the internal war you wage every morning and realize that the moment you begin to debate with yourself, you have already lost. Second, the micro-entry. You must design a task so small that it is impossible to fail, a sharpening of the pencil for your specific craft. Third, the contextual anchor. You must tie this task to a trigger that already exists in your environment. You do not wait for motivation. You wait for the triggered. I am issuing you a 14-day samurai challenge. This is not a request, it is a test of your resolve. For the next 2 weeks, you will pick one singular action that moves the needle in your life. If you are a writer, it is writing 50 words. If you are an athlete, it is putting on your shoes and walking out the front door. If you are an entrepreneur, it is opening your CRM. You will do this at the exact same time every day. You are forbidden from judging the quality of the work. You are forbidden from doing more if it feels like a strain. Your only metric of success is that the action existed. By day 7, your ego will tell you this is too easy. It will tell you that you are wasting your time and that you should return to your old ways of grinding. Do not listen. That is the voice of the old self trying to pull you back into the trap. By day 14, you will notice the silence. You will realize that you no longer need to force the start. The resistance has been starved of its fuel. You have begun the process of moving the habit from the exhausted prefrontal cortex to the relentless basal ganglia. You are becoming a man of Mushin. Time is passing anyway. Whether you take this challenge or continue to drown in your own overthinking, 14 days will disappear. You can spend them in the same cycle of shame and inconsistency, or you can spend them rebuilding your soul. The path is right in front of you. It is small, it is quiet, and it requires nothing but your presence. Stop fighting yourself. Stop trying to be a hero and start being a practitioner. Sharpen the pencil. Draw the line. Walk the path. If this message resonated with your spirit, leave a comment below with the word unshakable to commit to the 14-day challenge. Subscribe to join this brotherhood of discipline. Be present. Walk with honor. Follow the path. Until the next video.